he keeps. That's all for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. More MTP Daily, of course. The Beat with Ari Melber starts right now. Good evening, Ari, and you're now in waiting for Paul Manafort sentencing mode. Good luck.
Thank you. We expect it any moment. Thank you, Chuck Todd. There is big breaking news here. At any moment, as mentioned, a federal judge in Virginia will be sentencing Donald Trump's former campaign chief, Paul Manafort. We know this will happen soon because they've already had one recess and they've run late, meaning we expect any moment in this 6 p.m. hour on the East Coast, the end of the workday in Alexandria, Virginia, we expect to get the sentence. This could be the biggest, most damaging day ever in the Mueller probe so far. We know that because Manafort faces up to 24 years in prison in the courtroom you're looking at alone in Virginia. He faces 10 more years for his case in D.C., time he might not have faced had he not broken his plea agreement. That sentencing is next week. Now, Paul Manafort arrived in the courthouse this afternoon in a wheelchair, we could see from the sketches in our court reporters, in a green jumpsuit. That's the same as his last trip to court in October. This judge, T.S. Ellis, who has been at times critical of prosecutorial overreach, did not give Manafort any credit for accepting any responsibility. And his ruling on the sentence, as I mentioned, could come any moment. This is our special coverage. I want to go right to the courthouse. NBC's Ken Dilanian is there. And Ken, the latest news we have, which I want to talk to you about here that's pretty interesting, is Mueller's prosecutors going in on Paul Manafort here. This is the last time they get to do that before the judge decides. As you know, and for your analysis, we hear Mueller's prosecutors saying they spent, quote, hours with him, but that was not reflective of any value, meaning don't credit him for the time they spent. Indeed, they say he wasted the precious time of Mueller's team, quote, 50 hours with us because he lied. He lied. So it took longer to provide the truth to him. What are you seeing, Ken?
It's fascinating, Ari. Another quote from Prosecutor Greg Andres: hours of time spent with the special counsel are not reflective of the value of information we received. That solves a little bit of a mystery for us, Ari, because we had thought that even though Manafort ultimately was found to have lied, he spent so many sessions with the special counsel, it stood to reason that he provided them at least some useful information. But they're coming to the court today and saying, in fact, no, he told us nothing that we didn't already know. He was completely useless as a cooperating witness. That is bad for Paul Manafort, but it also seems to me it's bad for the Mueller investigation. I mean, they cut a deal with him for a reason. They thought that he could provide them useful information pertinent to their case about whether there was a Russian conspiracy. Apparently, he didn't. And as you know, Ari, none of the major questions that we have about Paul Manafort and whether he colluded and whether he provided polling information that found its way to the Russians, none of that's going to be answered in this hearing. But what is going to be answered is how long Paul Manafort's going to spend in prison, at least in this Virginia case. And as you said, the guidelines call for up to 24 years. Nobody thinks Ellis will go that high, but it's not looking good for Manafort. He seems to be losing on every key point that could argue for a lower sentence. What
does it tell you that the Mueller folks are, in a sense, really throwing the book at him? They did not, as you and I note, and there is a legal distinction, they didn't say, Judge, this is exactly the years that we want, and that can happen in other cases. But they are clearly in emphasis right now at this late hour in that courtroom going back over what they say Paul Manafort did that made him worse than a traditional convict. That is to say, busted, convicted, then lying to prosecutors post-conviction. They're trying to show, I think, that they were looking at this more harshly than a traditional convict.
I agree with you. And, you know, I'm not sure that we should read anything into the fact that they didn't recommend a sentence, because they have not done that in any of the cases. It seems to be their modus operandi that they say, here's what the guidelines call for. We don't object to that. And the guidelines are so harsh in this case. I mean, let's not forget, this is not a violent crime. Paul Manafort doesn't have a history of criminal offenses, and yet he's facing, you know, more than some people get for murder, 24 years, on top of a sentence that he will get of perhaps 10 years in Washington, D.C. So,
and Ken, I'm going to cut in to say we're hearing from our court reporters here through our control room that they've just announced Paul Manafort will speak. Not something he chose to do during the trial. He never took the stand. He's known to be a skilled communicator up to a point. He has a law degree. What do you think of this news breaking literally this moment that Paul Manafort will speak to the court before he gets this sentence?
Well, it would be the first time that he would speak publicly since 2017, when a gag order was imposed on him in this case. And here is his chance to essentially express remorse, to put into context the crimes that he's been convicted of, and plus the admissions that he made in Washington, D.C. for this judge, T.S. Ellis, who, as you said, has expressed some skepticism about the entire special prosecutor case and has said that the only reason Manafort is in court is because he went to work for Donald Trump. And so, this is essentially Manafort's chance. If he has any possibility of avoiding a massive prison sentence, it may be in what he says to this judge tonight.
Ken, we can't predict the what of how many years he'll get. We can't predict the when. We're told it could be any moment based on what's coming out of a proceeding that's already ran long. We can, on the beat, predict the who. We will be coming to you when we get this breaking news. Thank you for your court reporting. We'll be coming back to NBC's Ken Dilanian.
I will be here for you.
As part of our special coverage on what is one of the biggest nights in the Mueller probe thus far, I'm joined by Matt Miller, former DOJ official under President Obama, David Corn, Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones, Jason Johnson from The Root, and Aisha Moody-Mills, a Democratic strategist and fellow now at Harvard's Institute of Politics. Matt, how does this usually work, and how is it working tonight?
Well, one, it's going long because I think we're all being reminded from the trial that this judge, Judge Ellis, likes an audience. He has an audience right now. A lot of people gathered, and so he's going to take his time and say everything that he wants. I think it's interesting that Manafort's going to speak to the judge. I think clearly he's going to try to convince the judge that he does accept responsibility, something the special counsel in his sentencing memo said Manafort has not done, and argue that he tried to cooperate, and then basically beg the court for mercy. That will be, the case he makes, I think, will be one that's diametrically opposed to the one the special counsel has been making both in their filings and in court today. I think the interesting thing about the tack they've taken, every time they've had a choice with Manafort, whether to go easier or go heavier, really even to go between going heavy and going heavier, they have always chosen heavier. And you see that again today with the arguments they're making to the judge.
David, it's easy to forget just how historic a night this is with everything going on, but this was the #1 person in charge of Trump's campaign. And take a look at what Mueller's done so far and how that compares as we all kind of are reacquainted with the facts. Most of the people sentenced up to this point for what are sometimes called process crimes were there under a year. Cohen was handed off from Mueller and ultimately got 3 years in New York. Gates and Flynn, who flipped, Gates flipping explicitly on Manafort, we don't know yet their sentences. But it's very clear that anything north of 3 years, let alone 10 or 15, tonight would be by far the most serious sentence Mueller has won.
Let's have a pop quiz. Remember who John Mitchell was? The Attorney General, but also the campaign chairman for Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. He went to jail for Watergate. He was sentenced to 1 to 4 years, served 19 months, and got out.
David, I'm gonna let you continue, but I didn't know you were gonna quiz. We'll quiz with you. We remember him. We also remember John Dean, Haldeman, Ehrlichman. We'll put these up. Their original sentences, to your point, were in the range here of 4 and 8 years.
I mean, we're looking
And then look
now,
at this. Look at what Manafort's looking at. And go ahead, David.
I was going to say, Paul Manafort is on the verge of setting a very not wanted record. The prosecutors are asking for 19 years, even if the judge gives him half of that, and he still has to be sentenced for another set of crimes next week. He may way beat the record of any former campaign manager who goes to jail. I mean, this is really historic. I don't think, we get lost in the day-to-day, but Donald Trump's top campaign guy is going to jail for a very long period of time. And while these charges don't allude to collusion, when we can get to this perhaps later, the case, as it was brought by Mueller, raised some very serious questions about Paul Manafort colluding with Russia while he was campaign manager.
Jason?
So there's a couple things about this, Ari. One, purely politically speaking, yes, it's damaging. Yes, it was Trump's campaign manager. But this also has consequences for 2020, and not just from the standpoint of scandal. Who wants to work with this guy anymore? I mean, there's a very practical issue here that as Donald Trump prepares to run for president again in 2020, that he's going to have a tremendous amount of difficulty really putting together a staff when you see these kinds of legal consequences for being anywhere near his campaign. The other issue is this, and this trickles down all the way through Washington, D.C. Paul Manafort was kind of a god of war. He had his fingers in all sorts of different, dictators and problematic people in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, and he's eventually being taken down for playing the same kind of funny money games that a lot of people here in Washington, D.C. do. This is not about Russian collusion because, again, the Mueller trial, the Mueller investigation said he didn't necessarily help that much with that, but this is a warning. This is cleaning the swamp. This is a warning to everyone who does this kind of business in Washington, D.C., that if you get too close to Trump, if you get too close to the wrong kinds of people, you can actually suffer serious jail consequences. This guy's going down for a serious bid, and it's not going to be something he can laugh about or that other people on K Street can just say, that only happened to him, it won't happen to me.
Aisha?
Yeah, so here's the thing. We still have a situation, though, where it seems like all the president's men are going down, but there's still not quite anything sticking to the president.
Well,
and
but
so
I'm asking you
curious
about Paul Manafort. Everyone loves to go chase Donald Trump. We're not doing that tonight. I mean, what I'm looking at here is the guy who ran the campaign could get, as David was discussing, a sentence on par with one of the greatest in the last 50 years. What is the significance, in your view, of that, even if Donald Trump's not accused of anything?
Well, I agree with Jason. I think it's draining the swamp, and I think that he deserves to be held accountable for his crimes. I mean, here's the thing. Yeah, he's the campaign manager, and I think it matters that we set a precedent that these so-called white-collar, quote-unquote, crimes are still high crimes. And so I think that this is a really great thing that he's being held accountable. But, Ari, I don't think that we can kind of skirt around the fact that, there's still the question of what does this mean in a grander scheme. And I think that, it's true that anybody else who comes in 2020 to work with this president is going to question, how they're working with this president. And then also there are a lot of questions that still remain to be answered, that perhaps the way this sentencing is going down is a precursor to us getting to the bottom of something else. And
we're getting word now Paul Manafort has begun to speak. This is literally one of the last legal things before he learns his fate, before he gets his sentence. Matt, that is something that he never did at trial. His lawyers obviously determined, as the case with many defendants who were ultimately convicted, that taking the stand to defend themselves would hurt themselves because it opens them up to so many things they'd have to talk about. What do you think of him now, literally at this moment, this hour tonight, speaking? And second, one other clue from the court proceedings, because we're literally in breaking news, Matt. One good sign, potentially, for Manafort, at least in the amount of time, was Judge Ellis saying that some of the other cases that the Mueller folks were pushing back on may actually help Manafort. The idea being that his side was able to cite some cases where people would be getting the lower end sentence, not necessarily the max.
Yeah, and I think the response to that from the Mueller team, I would suspect, is it would be taken from their filings when they argue this kind of remarkable thing. The reason why Manafort is likely to get such a stiff sentence, the reason why the guidelines are so long in his case, they looked around at other past defendants, other past people who've been convicted and sentenced, and couldn't find anyone similarly situated anywhere in the country, anytime in recent memory. He's getting this stiff sentence because he is one of the most serious white-collar criminals the Justice Department has prosecuted in recent years. His crimes range from tax evasion to money laundering to obstruction of justice. And so when you commit all those crimes, you're going to get a very serious sentence. And I think the reason you see him up speaking for himself now is because those facts against him are so bad, and it's his last chance.
I'm going to cut in for this. We have breaking news in the sentencing of Paul Manafort, him taking basically a chance to address the court one final time. Ken Dilanian at the courthouse. What's happening?
Ari, this is being relayed to me from inside the courthouse that Paul Manafort gave a fairly short statement in which he did not apologize, did not seem to express remorse, did talk about the difficult period that he has been through with his family. He said, the last 2 years have been the most difficult for my family and I. He said, to say that I have been humiliated and ashamed would be a gross understatement. I have felt punishment. And lastly, he asked the judge for compassion. But again, did not apologize, did not say I'm sorry, did not really speak to the details of his crimes or express any remorse for his actions, Ari.
And I'm looking at the notes as you are, because we're just getting this right now. Ken, what do you think about Manafort here saying that I have felt punishment during these proceedings, an apparent reference to solitary confinement, according to our colleague, where he says, quote, I've had much time to repent. I ask for your compassion.
Right. Well, he's saying he had much time to repent, but he's not really discussing any kind of repentance or remorse for his actions. I think a lot of people are going to read into this essentially that Paul Manafort feels sorry for himself, is essentially telling the judge, look, I've had a really rough time in solitary confinement, you know, please go easy on me, without actually speaking to the acts of which he has been convicted and to which he has pleaded guilty, Ari.
Well, it's remarkable. I'm told they've just gone into recess. We're processing all of this, Ken. When I look at the statement, I have felt punishment during these proceedings, and I have had time to repent. The question is how that affects the judge. The big decision now is out of the hands of Mueller. It's out of the hands of a lot of us analysts, observers, reporters. It's now down to one person in our system, this judge, and whether he looks at these comments as something that, A, he wants to incorporate into his decision, and if so, do they help or hurt? There will be people who look at a statement saying, I've felt punishment, and they think the only reason Mr. Manafort was even in pre-trial detention was because he committed new crimes after being convicted. That is a wanton act that even many hardened criminals are rarely accused of.
Absolutely, Ari. And even though Judge Ellis has expressed skepticism about the special counsel and about where Manafort figures in these proceedings, and even though he's reputed to be a light sentencer on white-collar offenders, this kind of statement I cannot sit well with a judge, where a defendant comes before the court, doesn't even mention any of the offenses he is admitted to and has been convicted of, doesn't say apologize, doesn't express remorse, simply says, I've had a rough time in solitary. I can't imagine that Judge Ellis is going to treat that kindly. I mean, he may take into account the time that Manafort has served, certainly, and he may have strong feelings about the fact that Manafort wouldn't be here if he hadn't joined the Trump campaign. But nonetheless, he's faced with the overwhelming evidence and a conviction and guilty pleas in Washington, D.C., and a massive record here that argues for a long prison sentence.
Ken, stay with me. I'm adding back in our panel. You and I are following our colleagues' notes. We're in what is the brief recess before for Paul Manafort, what will be D-Day in the coming moments when the judge retakes the bench here, 6:16 p.m. on the East Coast, and issues his fate, his verdict. Jason, I want to be very clear about this humiliation.
Right.
That's Paul Manafort's word. He says he's been humiliated. And I think in our system of crime and punishment, the question is when? Because clearly it wasn't there when he was first convicted.
Right.
And he continued to fight it and did not take responsibility. And it wasn't when he pled out. Because, again, since then, he has been found to be responsible for having continued to lie to prosecutors in a felonious manner, blowing up his own plea agreement. Most people don't get such a sweetheart deal anyway, by the way. But he got that plea deal that he blew up. So if the judge looks at this, isn't it a reasonable question to ask, well, when exactly were you humiliated, given that your felonious conduct went all the way through post-conviction?
Ari, his statement from what you've read is basically, I feel really bad that I got caught. That's it. He's not apologizing for anything. And I think whether it's Roger Stone or Michael Cohen, and certainly with Manafort, hearing that kind of statement and hearing the arguments this lawyer's been made, it is a microcosm of the sort of injustices sometimes of our criminal justice system and what people do think they'll be held accountable and what people don't. You can go from Meek Mill to 21. You can ask anybody. You can ask a random person on the street here in Washington, D.C. if they had committed half of the crimes, for half the amount of money, a third of the amount of money that Paul Manafort is involved in, they would have thrown away the key a year and a half ago.
Well, and to your point, Jason, I mean, we've been covering this on the show because it's part of the larger ambit as some of the allies of the president have argued that there was some sort of overreach or aggressive conduct, when in fact it's the opposite. Most poor defendants, including often black and brown defendants, are in pretrial detention for money reasons. Paul Manafort and Roger Stone, up to this day, having even been accused of threatening a judge, were walking free. And it was only after further accusations out in public that they, in the case of Manafort, had the detention. In Stone's case next week, he'll have another hearing on it. How do you view that context, given what is his final message? We're finally hearing from Mr. Manafort tonight.
Yeah, he still doesn't get it. And if that's the last statement that he's going to make before he faces this sentencing, I am disturbed and impressed at the arrogance that he demonstrated. And clearly, he learned nothing from his time in jail, because this was an opportunity to demonstrate penitence. This was an opportunity to say, look, I made mistakes, but I have learned my lesson. I will never do something like this again. I violated the trust of the American people and the FBI and the Mueller investigation and everybody else. And rather than coming forward and showing just a drop of humility, he talks about humiliation, which is about his own arrogance, and that's not going to sit well with any judge.
Aisha and then David.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with all of that, and I know you don't want me to do this, Ari, but Paul Manafort to me is really symptomatic of a bigger cancer that kind of moves through our society that we don't really talk about until now. And so I am so thankful for you for actually talking about on your show the discrepancy in the way that the police are even treating this guy and what's happening with him with regards to his imprisonment. But there has been for too long a certain type of bad actor that gets away with a slap on the wrist, a certain type of bad actor who generally happens to be a rich white guy that can literally have crimes against our government, be in cahoots with not only a foreign agent, but one of the most hostile to the United States foreign agents, and kind of can shrug it off. And I think that with this sentencing, I am hopeful that this is a sign that's like no more. Like, we're not going to have that in our society anymore, that people will be held accountable. But there is a bigger picture to this that I hope that people walk away from.
And David, all of this is coming against a backdrop where Rudy Giuliani has been out battling with Michael Cohen, another flipped witness who proved troublesome for Donald Trump. There are reports from other news outlets that Giuliani was back at the White House today. Take a listen on this pardon question to how the president discussed it regarding Manafort earlier.
One of the reasons I respect Paul Manafort so much is he went through that trial.
Are you considering pardoning Paul Manafort?
I have great respect for what he's done in terms of what he's gone through. You know, he worked for Ronald Reagan for years. He worked for Bob Dole. I would say what he did, some of the charges they threw against him, every consultant, every lobbyist in Washington probably does.
David.
He also worked for warlords and kleptocratic thugs. I can't even say it.
People so evil, you can't even say it.
I mean, he didn't just work for Ronald Reagan.
No, I'm referring to the kleptocrats.
Yes,
thugs.
But Paul Manafort doesn't even reach Michael Cohen levels of contrition. I mean, at least Michael Cohen cooperated fully with Robert Mueller and then testified before Congress and kind of admitted to getting off on the wrong path, right? And now the scales are from his eyes. He's no longer wowed and dazzled by Donald Trump and fame and fortune. You know, he's doing this after he got caught, of course, but at least telling us a story of a man who sees things differently and now just wants to help. Manafort couldn't bring himself to do that. And I was thinking, as you and Ken were going over the statement, which is this the sort of statement that one would make if one still is hoping for a pardon from Donald Trump?
What do you read in that?
Because he's not admitting he did anything wrong. He's not saying, I'm going to do everything I can to make this right, and I will go back and now start cooperating with Robert Mueller, which he's always free to do. Maybe too late, but he still can try.
And let me read those statements for viewers who are joining us, and then for the points you're making, David. And for viewers joining us, 6:22 p.m. on the East Coast, we have a recess in the sentencing proceedings of Paul Manafort. He's already spoken. The only thing we're waiting for is the judge to come back into the courtroom here in what is a late-night session now by the standards of normal federal court, and issue the actual sentence. David Corn has been talking about what Mr. Manafort said, breaking his silence. This is big. We haven't heard from Mr. Manafort in any forum since he went in. And he says tonight, and David, for your response to the points you were making, I'm reading from our court reporter's notes here. The last 2 years have been the most difficult years for my family and I. To say I have been humiliated and shamed would be a gross understatement. Mr. Manafort said he was making the statement to the court while seated in his wheelchair in his prison uniform. Being separated from my family for the past 9 months has been very hard, he says. Quote, I have felt punishment during these proceedings. He refers to solitary confinement, saying I've had much time to repent, and I ask for your compassion. David.
Well, think about this. If he's still trying to get a pardon from Trump, he's saying, I've taken a lot of hits here. I've taken a lot of lumps. And as Mueller says, I haven't cooperated. I haven't helped them find out what really went on. Yeah. So you know, I see this as perhaps a play for Trump even late in the game here because he figures he has nothing else left. I mean, you're a lawyer. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's an important context you just put on it, because someone who only was speaking to the audience of one of the judge could certainly use words. Words are free. Words are easy. Yeah. He could use more words to talk about why he should be given judicial compassion. But as you point out, David, he may have a different audience of one in mind, someone with the unilateral pardon power in the White House. What we're going to do, because this is our special coverage, is keep an eye on this. Ken Dilanian with us, along with our other reporters at the courthouse. When this recess comes back out, we're going to tell you. We're going to keep you posted on all of that, and much of our special coverage panel will return. Right now, I have other breaking news, and I want to tell you what it is. President Trump's new Attorney General, Bill Barr, has announced, of course, that Bob Mueller could finish his probe as soon as this week that we're in. And there are these new signs. The congressional leaders actually think the Trump administration might bury Mueller's findings today. Powerful chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, which of course oversees DOJ and handles potential impeachment, he says there are signs that Bill Barr and Rod Rosenstein are building a case to bury the findings. Now, we just spoke by phone, and Nadler is warning the DOJ against exploiting the now famous policy against indicting a president to potentially cover up what Mueller finds.
If you take the position that the president cannot be indicted, no matter how much proof you have, and therefore we're not going to comment on whatever evidence we have, then you converted that rule, a normally good rule, into a cover-up. If you withhold that information from Congress because you can't indict the president as a matter of law, then it's a huge cover-up.
That is from our discussion today. Chairman Nadler told me a few other interesting things about why he says his new probe of Trump corruption has to be broader than Mueller. I'm going to play you that statement as news in a moment. I also want to tell you the whole push comes as House Democrats are using their power to force a floor vote as soon as next week on releasing the Mueller report. Now, that matters because Democrats would then be forcing Republicans to get on the record about transparency, raising the question, if Mueller doesn't have anything damning against Donald Trump, this is what I want to emphasize here. The question that would be raised by that vote on the House floor is, if they have nothing against Trump, why wouldn't you want to release the Mueller report? So to get into all this, I want to bring back DOJ official Matt Miller and reporter David Korn, part of our broader coverage as well.